So let me go ahead and introduce our panel. So the first person on my right is Mark Duyvil, who's well known to everybody here. He received his MD from Georgetown. He worked at the Clinical Center. He was the director of the PEPFAR program, and he's currently the co-director of the Global Health Law Program at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown. Let's see, next to him is Art Reingold. Art Reingold received his MD degree from the University of Chicago. He was an EIS officer for the CDC, and he's currently professor of epidemiology and associate dean for research at the University of California in Berkeley. And next to him is Christine Lubinsky, who is a vice president for global health for the Infectious Disease Society of America, and before that, she was the executive director for the HIV-MA, the HIV Medical Association for the membership of the Infectious Disease Society that dealt with HIV infection. Next to her is Jim Rooney, who received his MD degree from the University of Maryland, worked at the NIH, and is currently Vice President for Medical Affairs at Gilead. And then finally is Dr. Greg Pappas, who has a PhD from Case Western, worked for DHHS, was a policy advisor for the Secretary of Health, and is currently a senior, or currently the director of a lot of things for the Washington Health Department. Director of HIV/AIDS, hepatitis, STD, and tuberculosis. So that's the panel, and I think what we'll do is have each person give a few remarks. I had some pointed questions, and I think I'll get there. Our panel really follows another panel that covered a lot of the grounds. I think to get started, what I'd really like to have our panel do is to deal with what they view as the major challenges as we move forward. And by that I mean both the domestic problem and the PEPFAR program. In terms of what we all realize is limited resources and a great deal of anguish about how we're going to be able to keep a PEPFAR program afloat in these economic times, at a time when there is also an ambition to broaden the program in a lot of ways that may, to many of us, may compromise some of the AIDS activities. And then we also have a sort of a domestic challenge because of the issues associated with sustaining the people that are on care. With a ballooning epidemic in the United States, it's adding 30 or 40,000 new patients every year to those that need to have these drugs that are so resource expensive. So Mark, why don't we start with you, and perhaps you could address some of the issues on the global front.
Sure, happy to. First, it's always great to be at anything for Tony. I'm glad Veronica created this award because I think we've run out of the old awards to give Tony, so we have to make new ones to give to him. So congratulations, Tony. And you know, we wouldn't have PEPFAR were it not for Tony's leadership working with the Bush administration, which I was privileged to work with him on. I actually think we're looking at this in way too defensive of a posture. You know, we didn't have money back in 2001, 2002 either. President Bush just stood up and did it. We had budgetary constraints every year. What we need to do is proactively make the case and make the case well. And the case is really there. And we're in a pivotal moment very similar to where we were in 2002, where the science had gotten to the point where treatment was possible. Now, we had a lot of people giving us all the reasons why we couldn't do that, including budgetary. There were huge budget fights back there. People in Africa, this horrible paternalism, couldn't possibly do something as complicated as antiretroviral therapy, that awful, pernicious, paternalistic myth. All the same things we're hearing today about why we can't do anything, we heard in 2001 and 2002. And we're actually at a pivotal moment like we were with treatment back then on prevention. In the last year and a half, the science has advanced to the point where we can actually talk about ending this epidemic. We have interventions showing that treatment is a good prevention tool, 96% reduction in transmission. Male circumcision, an oldie but a goodie, getting better over time. 60% prevention initially, now up to 68%. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, whether in microbicide or oral versions, between 40 and 73% reductions. This is one of the greatest opportunities we've ever had. And the window is very short. If you look at all the prevention data, everyone talks about expansion of treatment, which is fantastic. 6 million people, 6.6 million up from 50,000 when President Bush launched PEPFAR. But if you look at the prevention data, 22 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have had greater than a 25% reduction in HIV rates and incidence, actually in incidence if you calculate it off prevention. So the trajectory is actually going down in almost all of sub-Saharan Africa, while it's going up in places like Eastern Europe. And that's really exciting unless you look at Uganda, which also had 30 to 50% reductions like we're seeing in most of the rest of the continent now, 5 years ago, but now we have a 4% increase. So we're actually on a downward trajectory, but that's not going to last. The behavior change tools are very good. They're effective. We've seen that. Condoms are effective. Delaying sexual debut is effective. Reducing partners is effective. But it's probably not durable, and it's not going to get us to 0.5%. We're on the downward trajectory, but if we don't act now and implement these scientific advances on the ground, which will be difficult and challenging, but we know we can, if we can do treatment, we can do this stuff. If we wait, the trajectory is going to be going back up. And that means it's going to be more expensive, and we might not actually be able to do it. We may actually lose this window in time to continue that downward trajectory. And Tim Hallett from Imperial College has done a model showing we can get down to basically controlling the epidemic completely with the interventions we have today if we act in an intelligent and strategic way. So, you know, the challenges are the same they always are. Political will, focusing on what needs to be done, but the opportunity is enormous, and we need to make that case. And we need to make the case that the window is short. We can't just delay for 5 years because of the budget, because we're not going to be in the same position. We're probably going to be on an upward trajectory again instead of a downward trajectory. And these interventions will save an enormous amount of money over time. If you're worried about the so-called treatment mortgage, guess what it's going to be like in 5 years if we don't drive the epidemic down? And not to mention all the people whose lives will be saved, the infections that will be averted, all the orphans that will be averted. You can actually model out this great benefit. So instead of being in this defensive posture of, oh, what are we going to do? The budget's bad. It's always bad. Let's stand up and make the case and push people to do what's right, which is end the AIDS epidemic. And now we can actually talk about that. So I'd rather just take that approach and take the challenges head on, but make the case and make it strongly and make it well. And we know when you do that, you can actually succeed.
Thank you. Art?
Well, that's a hard act to follow. I was thinking about the question Ken asked, where were you at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic? And I think it's important in terms of my take on this. Like Jim, I was at CDC. If you remember back to the early 1980s at a time of emerging infections, I worked on the two that didn't turn out to be very important, I guess. One was toxic shock syndrome and one was Legionnaire's disease. And those two were also important at the time and sort of didn't persist in quite the importance that HIV/AIDS has. But the third one that I worked on was epidemic meningitis in West Africa. And at the time, I was, as you said, an epidemic intelligence service officer, and doing my own studies of how well the vaccine we had worked and in what age groups and how long it lasted. And every year I would go to Ouagadougou, the capital of then Upper Volta, to do my studies with suitcases full of microbiology materials and sometimes a microbiologist. And what was notable about those studies is I did them myself, with sometimes some American help, pretty much without any help of any African. Certainly I had a translator to help me with people who didn't speak French or English, but fundamentally it was what we might call parachute epidemiology. There was no interest or emphasis put on capacity in Africa. There was no attempt to build capacity in Africa. We got the work done, but we got the studies completed, but we certainly didn't leave Ouagadougou a better trained place with any capacity than it was before we arrived. And in the 25 years or so that I've been at Berkeley and in academia, I've been privileged to have a grant from NIH, from the Fogarty International Center, whose purpose is to build capacity in countries in support of AIDS research. And I guess I think one of the key challenges going forward is how do we continue to build the capacity of people in poor countries to do the work themselves, to not only participate in research, but to plan the research, to implement the findings of the research, whether it's implementation science, whether it's impact evaluation in terms of treatment and prevention programs. Where do we find the resources for that? At the moment, CDC, through the PEPFAR program, does provide some modest resources for that, and Eric Gooseby deserves a lot of credit for being expansive in his view of how to use PEPFAR funds in this respect. NIH, certainly through the Fogarty Center, and I'm on their external advisory board, so I'm quite familiar with the work of Fogarty, with its very, very small budget, has also worked hard to improve capacity in poor countries, but this is an extraordinarily large gulf that I feel has not been suitably addressed. And we really need to be doing much more to build capacity in poor countries, to plan for the day when there won't be large numbers of U.S. academics there doing the work on behalf of poor countries, and that they are really quite able to do the work themselves. So for me, I think one of the biggest challenges is how to improve the capacity of poor countries to do most of this work themselves. It's not only an American mission, obviously Europeans, Australians, Japanese, other countries are involved as well. But for me, as we put more and more people on treatment, as we have more and more prevention programs, we really need to focus a lot more energy and attention on building capacity of scientists and investigators in poor countries to do this work themselves.
Thank you. Christine?
So as the only non-physician on this panel, I feel like I should disclose that I am a liberal arts major and a former Catholic school student. So I guess Linda D. was on target with her description of the activist community. But I come to this panel not, not as a researcher and a clinician, but as a longtime advocate in the field of AIDS, although long time is relative in this room. I've only been doing this work in AIDS since 1993, so compared to many of the people who have spoken and Dr. Fauci, I guess I'm a relative newcomer. But I want to pay tribute to Tony Fauci as the single most effective advocate for sound and effective HIV policy, both in the US and globally over the last 30 years. Part of the Renaissance man description that John Bartlett offered. And I guess I'm going to highlight, given the name of this panel, the big challenge, having evidence and science translate into sound public policy, because after all, we are sitting in the United States Senate, where sound and effective policy is sometimes a remote goal. And the disconnect between scientific evidence and policy is not new, certainly not new to AIDS. We have only to look at the longtime political opposition to federal funding for syringe exchange, to the disproportionate focus and funding for abstinence programs, both domestically and globally, despite the lack of evidence of their effectiveness, and the current bizarre provision in the PEPFAR law, the so-called prostitution pledge, which hampers efforts to engage sex workers in prevention and treatment, as just a few examples. Today, the ongoing budget debate crowds out our advocacy messages about the value of US-funded research and its implications in terms of programming for charting a course to actually ending the AIDS epidemic. HIV research findings in the last several years have been breathtaking, especially in prevention, and comparable to the research that led to life-saving ART in the early 90s. As others have noted, we have medical male circumcision. We have the now incredibly documented prevention punch of HIV ART and the promise of PrEP and microbicides, all of which are potent interventions for reducing incidence and changing the trajectory of the epidemic. And many of us who are advocates have spent months here on Capitol Hill trying to bring the excitement and energy of those research findings to policymakers in a general environment of AIDS fatigue, as Dr. Curran said, but also in the most difficult budget climate, certainly in the 30 years I've been doing advocacy here in Washington. And recent action right here in the Senate suggests that we're going to have a hard time of it and that we may squander important opportunities, at least for the time being. NIH itself and PEPFAR have both been slated for cuts for the second year in a row. And while I don't disagree with Linda D. in that they're modest, when you think of the scientific enterprise and all that needs to be done, and also that until a few years ago, we lived in a congressional environment where it would have been unheard of to cut biomedical research, unheard of. So in PEPFAR, just as with 9 million people clinically eligible for treatment today and new evidence about the ability of treatment to reduce infectiousness and treatment being cheaper than ever before, we're now going to have to do more with less. But despite this, I feel like our best arguments are the evidence and the science, and that we have to continue to educate policymakers about what the science tells us, and that champions of HIV research, like Dr. Fauci and like many of you in the room, must continue to play a pivotal role in driving policy and funding necessary to end the HIV epidemic. And I hope the forceful and optimistic views of Mark Duyvil come to pass. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Jim, can you bring us some sort of an industry perspective to what's ahead?
Sure. Thank you, John. And actually, before I do that, I'd like to also comment on where I was
Yes.
in 1982 when the AIDS epidemic was first described. I was actually a fellow at the LCI with Tony, who is the clinical director, who is the clinical director of NIAID at that point in time. So I had the great privilege of seeing him take care of patients firsthand. And it was always amazing to me how he knew so much about his patients, not only medically, but personally, and looked carefully after those outcomes on top of the outstanding, obviously, scientific achievements that we know about and all the administrative responsibilities that he's had. And indirectly, I've had the good fortune to continue to work with Tony and with the NIAID over the last many years, and it's been a great privilege for me, and I think it's contributed. And from my observation is that the process has been an incredible development that could be a model that would readily be used and could be used to the benefit of other therapeutic areas as well. So with respect to an industry perspective, I think there's two main areas I like to talk about. One is access, and the second is research, where industry can make an important contribution in this arena. First of all, with respect to access, obviously the majority of patients that are infected with HIV are not here in the US or in the developed world, but in the developing world. And we made incredible progress in terms of developing treatments over the past 20, 25 years. My first foray into industry was actually with Sandy Lehrman, who's here today as well, one of the inventors of AZT. I came to work at Burroughs Wellcome in the early 1990s, worked there for 4 years, had the privilege of working on some of the early treatments, or the early studies looking at combination therapies leading to the development of highly active antiretroviral therapy, and then moved on to Gilead. And I think since those early days, which have been discussed here in the last hour or two in terms of developing highly active antiretroviral therapy, the sort of second stage of developing those treatments was developing simpler, better tolerated, highly effective therapies. And that's been really the focus of the development of antiretroviral therapy over the past 10 years or so. Now we have combination therapies and single tablet regimens, both of which are critical, I think, not only to the success of therapy here in the US and the developed world, but also in the developing world, and will be a focus there going forward. So how do we make our medicines available One last comment on the development piece. It is a remarkable story, I think. A new disease, almost uniformly fatal, identifying the cause of that disease, and then pulling together government researchers, academic researchers, and industry, really in a partnership in a way that hasn't been done in any other therapeutic area recently, to come up with 30-some-odd drugs now, and the curve that Marty showed with an expectation now that an individual who starts therapy has an 80 to 90% chance of achieving full suppression of their virus and a normal lifespan is truly a remarkable achievement, and something that I think stands out amongst other therapeutic areas. Certainly that I studied when I was in medical school. I was interested, I think, in cardiology or GI as well, but came into infectious disease, into virology, where they had very few drugs for any virus at 30 years ago, and it's been a remarkable process to watch in the interim. And the role that the NIH has played in that actually has been critical. The network that's been established within the NIAID serves as a model for public-private partnership, and companies that participate in that, and I think we all share this, recognize that one of the reasons that it has succeeded is the collaboration that occurs not only between the activist community and the NIH and the academic investigators that are involved in terms of crafting the studies, but also with industry, who is included in the process, not just as an entity to provide drugs, but actually as a partner in the process that participates in protocol development, execution of the study, interpretation of the data, and presentation of the information, in addition to providing the drugs that are used in the studies. It is a truly remarkable system, and I think it's been incredibly effective. Just if you were to look at the number of studies that have been published out of the NIAID, NIH infrastructure, and the impact that it's had in terms of changing guidelines, et cetera, it's truly remarkable. So how do we get our drugs into the hands of those with HIV outside of the developed world, where the systems are well set up to make the distribution occur? And I think it's been a learning process for us. Almost all companies have a program in place to do this, and it's been a substantial challenge for us. Initially, we felt, well, if we make our drugs available, and there are regulatory mechanisms in most countries that allow for the import of investigational agents, that if there's an interest or a will in those countries, that there'll be an uptake of the medications, because clearly there's an incredible public health problem globally with respect to the disease that needed to be addressed. However, our initial experience in the early 2000s was indeed the uptake was really quite slow. So we looked very critically at what was going on, trying to identify ways to improve access, and identified certainly a variety of things, including regulatory barriers, relationships with distributors, the need to involve additional manufacturing capacity, regulations that were in place locally, import taxes and other things like that. So we began to aggressively tackle the problems one by one, and I'm giving an example from Gilead, but it applies to other companies as well, by initially registering the products in those countries so that they could be readily imported and distributed. For example, in the Gilead Access Program now we target over 132 countries. I think Viriad and Truvada are registered in over 100 globally, with registrations pending in others. And we began to form a network with distributors that could do the work locally in terms of doing regulatory work, as well as local education with physicians, and then found that was a successful first step, but it wasn't sufficient, and the price was still an obstacle in terms of making medications available. And we have pretty good chemists at Gilead. They're able to make substantial improvements in terms of the manufacturing process. But we felt engagement of additional parties and also increasing the volume, the scale of manufacture would help to drive down prices. So in conjunction with certainly PEPFAR and the Global Fund, Clinton Foundation, MSF, and others. We work to try to find ways to make the medications available at more affordable pricing. And one of the strategies that we adopted that's worked quite successfully is to give voluntary licenses to generic partners. We have almost a dozen licenses that have been granted to partners in India and Africa. We have half a dozen of those companies that have been very successful in terms of making both tenofovir and Truvada available at reduced prices. And where initially the cost of Viriad was over $1 a day, I think it was $1.35 when it was first put on the Access program almost 8 years ago. And through our partnership with our generic partners, more recently, I think the most affordable price through a generic partner was almost under 25 cents a day. So substantial improvements have been made in cost, and correspondingly, that's allowed countries to be able to access the drug, and for tenofovir, for example, to be used not only as a second-line agent, but to be considered as a first-line agent as well. And then lastly, more recently, after discussions for several years with Unitaid, one of the person who's in charge of our corporate medical affairs and access program is an attorney. He became quite interested in the challenge of and the role that intellectual property would play in terms of making medications available globally, and so we worked very closely with Unitaid, and we announced just recently that we had provided the rights, the intellectual property rights to our HIV drugs, the existing ones and the new ones in development, to the medicines patent pool, so that they can then sublicense to various generic manufacturers to make combinations that they prefer, and hopefully that'll help also to improve access to treatments in the developing world. So I think it's been a learning process there. I think it's been a successful model to date. I'm sure there are additional challenges ahead and additional things that we can do to improve it, but it's a model we hope to replicate for hepatitis B and for other important medical challenges in the developing world. With respect to research, I think that's a very important area that industry can contribute on. I've mentioned already the partnerships that we have with the NIH, also with the ANRS. I see Professor Del Frasi is here today, with the MRC and with others. And jointly, I think the research that's come out of that has been very informative. I'll mention on the NIH side 3 studies. One, a treatment study just recently reported in the past year, ACTG 5175, was the first large study that the ACTG did to look at regimens that could be optimal for initiating first-line therapy in the developing world. I think the results from that study were quite informative and will help drive guidelines going forward. 5221, looking at the question of how to treat patients that are HIV and HBV co-infected. I think that'll help also to inform also the Camellia study that was done by the ANRS, and others will help inform that going forward and provide important information on how to manage those patients. And obviously all the work that's occurred on the prevention front is also a collaboration, at least on the Gilead side, as a collaboration that began with the NIH almost 15 years ago or 20 years ago, initially in monkeys, data showing that a nucleotide analog, in this case tenofovir, could be used either systemically or when applied intravaginally topically to block simian lentivirus infection. And that began a development program done in partnership with the NIH and with others, eventually with the CDC, with the Gates Foundation, with USAID, looking at both topical and oral pre-exposure prophylaxis. And the fruition of that research, the phase 3 studies data have just become available over the past year, and I think that, along with the other study I'll mention, is HPTN 052, again a landmark study documenting for the first time the value of reducing viral load in terms of its ability to prevent onward transmission of HIV. And all of these studies, I think, will have a tremendous impact. We hope will be an important contribution to a combination prevention package. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, John, but from the industry perspective, I think that's a couple of things that come to mind.
Okay, thank you. Greg, it's lovely to have you here. to tell us, if you could, what you can about the Washington experiment.
First of all, let me see. First of all, it's a great honor to be here to recognize the contribution of Dr. Fauci, who's done so much, and much of this has been reviewed. I'm going to add to that the great foresight and leadership that Dr. Fauci has given in the DC initiative, which is allowing scientists in the community in DC to make a contribution to the evolving knowledge base in this area, also building important capacity in the district to contribute in that area. Most of you probably have heard of test and treat, but it's only part of a much broader set of scientific activities that include the hospital center. The one that I am most enthusiastic about actually is the DC cohort study done by GW in conjunction with the health department, where we're enrolling a large cohort of HIV-infected patients in the district. That it's going to be a scientific gold mine, but from the programmatic public health perspective, I'm equally excited about it because it's going to allow us to do things that most jurisdictions can't even dream of. We're going to be able to identify, one of the things, we're going to be able to identify practices and programs and look at their viral load and begin to address issues of how to improve quality of care and achieve durable viral suppression. We know nationally that we're not doing very well, and the district is not so different from that picture. So I'd just like to start very briefly. I'd like to tell you more about things that are going on in the District of Columbia, but I don't want to swerve from the reason we're here, which is to thank Dr. Fauci and recognize his contribution, and that contribution is very heartfelt here in the District of Columbia.
Okay, so could you go on now and tell us a little bit about that program? The test and treat, in terms of
Actually, I want to tell you about the broader strategic issues in the district, because I think that's where we're at here. As kind of following up from what Dr. Curran was sharing with us, we're at an interesting, exciting place in the epidemic. The science is there. There are an increasing number of tools. I'm going to add to that, we also have the national strategy, which from the programmatic and community perspective has been extremely salutary in bringing people together. There's been a lot of ruckus in communities about what to do, and the national strategy has really brought people together and giving us a template to move forward. This is, however, coming at a time of an international and national and local economic crisis. We're already beginning to experience cutbacks in the District of Columbia. So on my shoulders, I see the need to scale up. We know what to do. We can make a difference. We can help avert infections. We can help prevent deaths in the District of Columbia by scaling up the national strategy, but I have to do it with less money. I think the district is in a very unique opportunity to do so. And of course, test and treat fits into this very well because it's a kind of working through some of the scientific issues, but it's trying to figure out how we scale up. The district is in a unique situation because while the rest of the nation is struggling with health reform 1.0, we like to joke in the district that we're well into 2.0. We are active. We have been one of the national leaders in embracing health reform. We are actively, one of the reasons that we don't have ADAP waiting lists, 10,000 people waiting for drugs in the country. DC does not have ADAP waiting lists. It's because we are shifting people off of ADAP onto Medicaid. Many ways that we're embracing health reform that is making us, that is allowing us to go forward in a context of decreasing local resources. Our mayor is very devoted to maintaining our bond rating, does not want to run any deficit, and we have to live on the tax dollars that come into the city, and we are doing so, but still able to scale up. So that's the broad strategic issue that I think we can understand the importance of test and treat. Thank you.
Let me begin the second round here with what is often absent from these kind of discussions, but to me is kind of the elephant in the room. For example, when the Washington experiment got started and the homework was done, And the paper was published in Health Affairs by the people that are doing Stemvermund and Carl Diefenbach. What the estimate was there are 25,000 people in Washington, D.C. that have HIV infection. And there was an estimated something like 8,000 people who had no detectable virus. And we all think that, you know, the treatment is great and it works and this is a big scientific achievement. Maybe it's time to move on. But it's 8,000 out of 25,000. And when you look at it, the tiers are a bunch of people don't get treated. Those that get treated and are positive often never go into care. Those who go into care often don't take their meds and don't have adherence. I mean, that stair step is pretty steep. And I understand from Tom Quinn that it's the same in some African countries where he has done some similar analyses. And this is what this really is kind of operational research, which is not something that is commonly done. And actually, the guys at Emory, Carlos Del Rio and so forth, did the same thing for the country, and it looks like the same ladder so it applies to Washington, it applies to the country, and it may apply to the world, or much of the world. So I wonder if you guys could, people on the panel could deal with some of those issues. Mark, do you want to start this?
Well, I think we need to start by saying this is not unique to HIV. This is the pattern of clinical medicine. I mean, people don't stay. We have, how many studies do we have in every disease that this is the pattern of management of disease? So it's not unique to HIV. But we do have some extraordinary programs that have done really well in Africa at keeping people in care and in treatment and great follow-up. And there are programs in Zambia that have a 90% less than 50 at 2 years. And in a lot of the studies where we saw people getting lost, they actually weren't lost in care. They were lost in care in that center because there was a devolution of care, and as the programs expand, and instead of having to walk 5 hours to get to the hospital, people could go to a local clinic. That's what they were doing. So I'm not as pessimistic about what's possible, but I also think we just need to understand this is chronic disease management, and that is the nature of chronic disease. Find the models that work and expand them. And that's hard work. Everyone has their own program. Everyone has their pet ability, pet project and how they want to do things. But we actually do have some awfully good lessons learned on how to do this effectively. But we also just need to understand it's not going to happen, which to me comes back to prevention, prevention, prevention. We're never going to treat our way out of this epidemic. This is a chronic disease, and we're never going to solve the problem if we focus there, because this is not unique to HIV. It's part of clinical medicine. Which is not to say we can't do things and we shouldn't study it and modify over time, which I think people are doing a much better job than they get credit for. I also wanted to just slightly disagree with Christine. I mean, I actually, I was privileged to be a mentee of Tony as a clinician, as a researcher, and as a policymaker. And one of the things that I most learned from Tony is listen to what people are telling you. Listen to your patients. Listen to this experiment, see what the experiment's really telling you, and listen to policymakers. And sometimes it's not the words, sometimes it's how they act, sometimes it's the way they're shifting around in the bed or in their seat in a room. But I actually don't think that the Senate is filled with people who don't care about the U.S. interest or the staff. I actually think the staff up here and the members are incredibly dedicated public servants who, if you give them the arguments and spend the time with them, will do their best. Now, we may disagree with their outcome, and that's fine, but they are trying to find solutions. And if we work with them and sit down and talk with them about these issues in a way that resonates with them and respect where they're coming from and listen where they're coming from, they're telling us in these budgets, we're not going to cut everything, we're going to use scalpels, we're not going to cut everything, tell us where things are working, tell us what's proven, how do we shift money from what isn't working. People are open to things in ways that they weren't before. So I think a lot of it falls on us in the same way, the reason I'm tying this in the same way that as we go into the field and look at how do we maximize adherence, how do we keep people in care and treatment, we need to use that same kind of strategic lessons learned operations research on how to effectively advocate for things up here. And I think we can do that. I think we can do it both in the field and up here.
Thank you. Art?
So I think the problem you've pointed to is certainly a very real problem, and I think it in part, what Mark said is correct. Obviously, it's not unique to the management of HIV/AIDS. I think one of the challenges is that PEPFAR has been building its program in many places and countries where the capacity to deal with medical problems in general is extremely limited. And to build that capacity for one disease in a vacuum, in a vertical program, is obviously very, very difficult. And so the question becomes, what are the boundaries? That is, how much capacity building is it reasonable to do to extend beyond the HIV/AIDS problem to deal with the care and treatment of heart disease or cancer or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or all of the other problems that exist in poor countries and frequently coexist in the same patient population. And of course, one doesn't want to divert HIV/AIDS resources into a wide array of other disease problems. But fundamentally, it is very, very difficult to have vertical programs in these countries that deal with a single disease. So part of the problem is, given the resources that are there, what flexibility is there for taking on a wider mandate, and how do you integrate the HIV/AIDS services into the existing medical programs that are on the ground? And it goes back a little bit to what I was saying before. I think the people best positioned to do that are local investigators who generally have a better understanding of the system or non-system that exists in their country. As everyone who works in poor countries knows, there are very few such well-trained individuals. They typically have 3 or 4 jobs at a minimum in order to put bread on the table and send their kids to school. And they always have a better job on offer anytime they turn around. So to train and keep in place the people who can collect the kind of information about who's staying on treatment, who is not staying on treatment, why are they not staying on treatment, how can you improve the proportion who stay on treatment, you really need to increase the number of people available to do that kind of work. And then you need to give them the capacity to stay and actually do the work in their own country rather than be attracted away somewhere else. So I think there are a lot of challenges to doing that, and there's insufficient resources to really deal with the medical care delivery side of things in poor countries. We have a lot of challenges delivering medical care here in the United States. We're not necessarily in the best position to tell other countries how to do it. But the key question is, how do you do it in a context where there are obviously lots of other medical problems, and what's the most efficient and effective way of doing that?
Christine, I wish you would address that issue, but also you have your hands-on data about manpower issues for the future. I wonder if you could say something about that for the United States.
Sure. So certainly at the HIV Medicine Association, for at least the past 5 years, there's been a grave concern about where the next generation of HIV providers is going to come from. At IDSA, the infectious disease training program directors tell us that generally 1 out of 3 of their fellows is interested in HIV, but virtually all of them are interested in working globally, not domestically. Certainly somewhat recent surveys done about people in internal medicine and family medicine suggest that they feel ill-equipped to take care of people with this disease, with the notable exception of people who have been taking care of them for 25 years or so. So I think, so that's one huge issue, that it's not clear how that's going to be resolved. I think one of the major impediments is that HIV care is nowhere near reimbursed for what it costs to offer it. And that's why I think you've seen there are very few people doing private practice HIV medicine exclusively in the United States anymore. They're combining it with internal medicine or something else because it's virtually impossible to make a living. And if you talk to the leaders of HIV medical clinics in the United States, academically, whether they're based in academic medical centers or not, they'll tell you that they're operating at a profound financial loss And the only reason they're still around is really the Ryan White Care Act and the kind of supplementary support that offers in terms of staff and infrastructure. Although it remains to be seen how long that's going to be around. And what the implications will be for Ryan White after healthcare reform. I agree that I think the challenges faced in HIV in terms of adherence and all of that go across chronic disease. I think we actually have some tools that other chronic diseases don't have, like a Ryan White Care Act. And one of the ways I think we've missed the boat is the failure to integrate medical care with other support services being offered under Ryan White. Too often, those groups operate in parallel universes. And that might have been appropriate when there was no medical treatment that was effective for HIV. But there's been effective medical treatment for a very long time. And if there were more marriages between the CBOs who had peer educators and adherence support people in the medical clinics, I think we might do better for the patients. I know that under healthcare reform, there's strong interest on the part of HIV-MA. There are increased payments for primary care medicine. There are special provisions for places that operate as so-called medical homes, where all the patient's healthcare needs are met. The challenge, though, is this is being viewed totally through a primary care lens, and HIV is viewed as specialty care. So there's a lot of advocacy going on in the community, since so many HIV medical providers and their clinics are, in fact, monitoring their patients' hypertension, diabetes, bone density reduction, you name it, so that perhaps so HIV care arguably should be a model for what one of the models that already exists for what a medical home should look like. And at the same time, I think there's a worry that our community will be excluded from that opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you. Jim, you want to address this? Wait, one of the issues that is sort of embedded in this is we have a lot of trouble with patients that are non-adherent, and you've got it down to one pill once a day, and so forth. But is there evidence of progress in making it even simpler?
Well, yeah, no, certainly, John. I think simplification of therapy has been a very important advance in HIV over the past 10 or 15 years, and we all remember when HAART was first introduced and when patients had up to 18 pills or more a day that they had to take, sometimes at differing intervals during the day, multiple times a day, some with food, some without. So certainly simplifying the strategy for taking antiretrovirals, I think, has been a critical reason that we've been able to see some of the success that we have in terms of the very high levels of undetectable that we're now seeing in many, many communities. We had the first, certainly combination therapies occur in the late 90s, early 2000s, two-drug therapies, and then eventually leading, of course, in 2006 to the development of a tripla. And I'll make another comment here, too, with respect to development in companies, and just to recognize the fact that companies are oftentimes viewed as intense competitors, and they are, but I think the area of HIV is an example where companies have been actually collaborators in addition to being competitors. And I think looking back on previous precedents, I think you'd probably have to go back to the development or making available penicillin post-World War II, where companies were allowed to come together and work together to sort of make that happen. Many of you may remember there was a group called the Intercompany Collaboration for AIDS Drug Development, formed and actually an initiative by Merck initially back in the early 1990s, and the various companies involved in drug development at the time, antiretroviral drug development joined that group, and the purpose of the group was to share data and share their experiences, and also to share compounds, both for studies in the lab on combination therapy and also for the conduct of clinical trials. The group also did some studies themselves, but that really wasn't, I think, the main success of the group. The success of the group was bringing them together, and it took a lot to do that. There are a lot of legal restrictions that prevent companies from coming together and talking shop. So the focus was strictly on research. The meetings were always attended by lawyers, and we were always given instructions about what we could talk about and what we couldn't. But the bottom line was, I think it was very successful in terms of bringing together the people within those companies who were working on the development of new treatment strategies. And then even when the meetings were over, if you wanted to put together a study that involved drug X from another company, you knew who to call at that company, and you had a personal relationship with them that you could leverage for the multiple studies that were carried out outside of the context of the ICC. And I think that's actually the hidden benefit of that group that was never really recognized. So I think collaboration of companies has been another unusual aspect and an important contributor to the success of the treatments that we have today, and I mentioned that in the context of a triplet, which of course is a combination of 2 drugs from Gilead and 1 from Merck and BMS, efavirenz. There was another single-tablet regimen that was a collaboration between Gilead and Tibotec that just became available in the U.S. just a few weeks ago, Complera, and there are others that are in development. In the developing world as well, I think the Indian generic companies, the licensing agreements that we've granted, the voluntary licenses, allow them to make any combinations that they wish, and I think that gives them the latitude to make various combinations that are needed. They can price them as they wish, and they can compete with one another for tenders in those countries. I think that's helped to contribute to the success of making antiretrovirals available there. There'll be an important similar effort that will be required for pediatrics going forward. I think that's an important underserved area at this point in time in terms of therapies. So I see partnerships of companies working, innovator companies working also with generic companies to help make those medicines available there, because the generic companies are likely to be the companies that will be providing the majority of drug that will be made available in the developing world. Gilead's new access program, Access 2.0, had a specific feature of the access program that focused on pediatric development and provided certain incentives or rewards for companies to actually participate in the program with the contingency that they would help to facilitate the development of pediatric formulations. And the WHO, as you know, has been very involved in terms of crafting guidelines or strategies for appropriate weight band dosing for pediatrics. So that'll be a very important effort going forward, and one that the forum, I think, is involved with to some extent going forward as well. So certainly the development of simplified therapies will be very important going forward, and fortunately there is research currently ongoing that I think will lead to additional simplified therapies in the next year or two.
Thank you. Greg, one thing I wish one of the great things about the Washington experiment is that it is going to have a heavy investment in addressing the issue that I just mentioned. That is, how do you get people tested? How do you get them in care? How do you retain them in care? And this is the first time that I know of that there has been a very large allocation to study those issues, including the issue of P4P4P. Could you comment on that, or is it too early, or?
Actually, I want to comment on that by saying that, we're all about test and treat in DC, but I want to follow up with when Mark's comment that that we can't let prevention fall off the radar screen in this, and I sense it every day that it is. When I first came to DC in 1987 as a young physician scientist, I also came out as a gay man in a very vibrant, exciting community that was also beginning to address this horrendous epidemic. For years, there wasn't one social engagement, wasn't one social conversation that didn't involve HIV. And that activism, that consciousness and that movement, social movement, led to dramatic changes drops in new infections in the United States. Then we got antiretrovirals, and it stagnated. In fact, it's gone up among gay men for many years now. I think we can't lose it's amazing what I hear. Oh, Dr. Pappas, oh, condoms are so 1980s. Honest to God. This is what I get in our communities. So I think we need to, and the gay community has kind of moved on too. There are other things in life, but this is still nationally and in the District of Columbia, the group that is getting the highest percentage of infections. So we have lost something in the process, and lost something very, very valuable and something that's cost efficient. This is the major changes in the course of this epidemic in the United States happened before there was hardly any government money for any of this. As we know, it was mostly community that was fighting against government interference in what a community was trying to do to protect itself. So I want to second Dr. Duyvil's observation that we can't let prevention fall off the radar screen.
Okay, thank you. Are there any final comments? Christine.
I just want to make a comment on the global side, too, on this issue of vertical programs. I had the privilege last month to take 4 congressional staff to Kenya to visit HIV and TB programs. And I have to say, what I saw there was not vertical programs. I mean, what I saw there, every HIV clinic we went to visit was doing cervical cancer screening and treatment. They were doing TB screening and treatment. We went to the AMPATH program in El Doret, which was just breathtaking in its scope, and in fact is actually doing chemotherapy, radiation, portable X-rays on the community level to test for TB. And so I would argue that PEPFAR, in fact, built a primary care platform that was virtually absent in Africa, and that rather than crowding out other diseases, it's in fact provided the first opportunity ever to think about chronic disease intervention and management in low-resource settings. And when the congressional staff queried, the legend in his own time, Joe Mamlin, about this at AMPATH, I mean, what he said is, PEPFAR taught us the art of the possible. In other words, the argument about no way we can offer antiretroviral therapy, now had become the argument we can't possibly think of delivering cancer therapy in Africa, and in fact, they're doing all of those things. I may add, a robust group of African-trained now investigators, clinicians, and the like, but they've really transformed healthcare delivery overall. Instead of, in fact, just a unilateral focus on one infection. So.
I'd just add to that, as Christine was saying, treatment is the first time in development we have supported chronic care. It's the first time. We always did something that was easy in and out because we fundamentally didn't believe people in Africa could do it, which is pretty appalling. But we've gotten past that now, and these platforms are extraordinary. And last week, President Bush, Secretary Clinton, Susan G. Komen for the Cure, UNAIDS, and a whole bunch of great companies, Merck, BMS, Qiagen, Becton Dickinson, and some foundations are going to, in a public-private partnership, expand cervical and breast cancer services. And these are the types of things we can now do that weren't possible before. And relative to your last question, often we think about what have we learned here, and we've learned a lot about how to deliver services that we can take to Africa. We also need to think the other way around. And Mike Sagg, who many in this room know, has this great program called ZAMBAM, because he realized that their programs in Zambia weren't too dissimilar from what he needed to do in rural Alabama to address some of the issues you talked about. How do you get care and services out? How do you get people in them? How to use the community? So they actually took what they learned in Africa and how to do effective management, case management, and care and treatment and prevention, and they're now implementing it in Alabama. So we can actually learn an awful lot about what the incredible innovation and creativity of what's happening abroad can actually have an impact on what we're doing here. And I think we're not only past the paternalistic myth that they can't do it, I think we're entering a new era where we actually are learning from people in Africa as they're learning from us in a very dynamic and exciting way that has great benefit to us. And since we're in the Senate, I would just conclude by saying all of this stuff has other benefits too. We've talked about the health benefits, but when you go to those rural areas and you talk to the people at AMPATH, the Africans who've been running the clinic, or if you go into a rural area, people know the American people are there supporting them. And that has tremendous impact. When I was in a very rural place in Ethiopia, we went to a clinic, the only clinic, which is a PEPFAR-funded, supported clinic, and the head of that clinic was a town elder, because clinicians are very important in these small villages. And it was early morning, I was cranky and being a pain, and he kept saying PEPFAR, PEPFAR this and PEPFAR that, so being a snooty American, I said, so what does PEPFAR mean? And I expect him to say the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS. He said PEPFAR means the American people care about us. It was the most dramatic things I've ever heard. And these programs are tying us globally in a way that is unimaginable until you're on the ground and see the impact. And people really know what you stand for when you stand with them, and the impact of this in terms of our stature in the world, in terms of opportunities and economics. You know, we're talking about economics a lot these days. We're actually going to do some modeling on this, but I have no doubt that if we intervene in disease, we can see economic growth in Africa, which is necessary for our own economic growth, which any CEO in this country will tell you, that we need a vibrant Africa in 10 or 15 years if we're going to meet our own economic projections for job growth here. So while we talked about the health stuff, I think it's important to lay out that there are socioeconomic and geopolitical reasons we ought to be engaged in this stuff too. And if we package this all together, that's quite a positive story. And we just need to keep telling it and telling it and telling it until we get it done.
Thank you for finishing on a very optimistic note. That's a lovely way to finish. So thank you to the panel, and thanks for your participation.